October 17, 1943, 6:30, Berlin, Reichsmarschall office. A short note lay on a polished oak table. The corridor outside smelled of coal smoke and men in uniforms going too fast. For Adolf Galland, the note felt like a pulse he could not steady. He had come from the front lines and carried reports that contradicted comfortable doctrine. Across the city, Hermann Göring held a different certainty and a different map of the sky. The contradiction between frontline reports and central belief would not remain an argument on paper. It would become a choice that cost machines and men. Adolf Galland, general officer and commander of fighter forces in the West, had two things most leaders lacked at once: knowledge and urgency. What he brought to Göring would unsettle the comfortable narrative in Berlin. Reports from multiple squadrons claimed that American twin-engine fighters were operating at ranges and in patterns that suggested deliberate escort on deep raids, a practice the high command insisted was impossible. In a room that smelled of pipe tobacco and boiled coffee, Galland would say the word that sounded like accusation to some and like warning to others. He said that the P-38 Lightning was reaching where doctrine said it could not. Göring heard the sentence and smiled as if to dismiss a bad temper report. The smile hardened into instruction. A decision followed that evening and changed the calculus of air operations on the Western Front. In the next minutes, you will see the documents that came from the squadrons, the voices of pilots who flew into new skies, and the moment when a stubborn hierarchy refused what men on the wing were saying. We will reconstruct how a seemingly technical observation became a strategic turning point, and why failing to adapt to what was plainly visible in the sky cost lives and opportunities. The air in the briefing room was thin with cigarette smoke and winter damp. A chart with radius circles lay pinned to a board. A pilot had scrawled on it with a stub of pencil evidence of escorts appearing well beyond previously accepted reach. The room smelled of ink and machine oil. Hands tapped on the wooden edge of the map. Voices were low and urgent. "We logged continuous contact at 250 miles, said Captain Franz Becker, who had flown with Jagdgeschwader 26. They were not bogies, they were working in escort pairs, and they carried drop tanks, replied Major Helmut Bennemann, who had returned from a torn mission. Drop tanks extend range and change the game, said Galland, and pushed the pencil along a circle of estimated reach. His fingernail left a smudge of graphite. This contradicts operations estimations, said Oberstleutnant Karl Richter, the operations chief, and looked at the ceiling as if for the answer to come from above. The high command will say anomalies, said Lieutenant Klaus Meyer, junior voice tight. Anomalies cost pilots their lives, Galland answered. Archive it, came the curt reply from another office, the order that would echo later. Within days, losses that matched the new pattern appeared in the logs, and the argument could no longer be filed away. That contradiction between doctrine and report would become the central drama of this story. Adolf Galland had been a fighter pilot from the era when air combat remained intimate and vertical. His backstory is compact, but it shaped how he saw evidence and how loudly he would press it. He was born in 1912 into a family that prized aviation. He rose through the ranks as a pilot who trusted what he saw over what maps suggested. During the Spanish conflict and early campaigns, he had learned to listen to pilots returning with faces hollowed from a kind of exultant fear. Those experiences taught him to read an after-action report as one reads a human temperature. He had become both skilled and impatient with bureaucracy. When he reached command, he brought the impatience forward and wore it as an instrument. The front line let him watch men and machines in the raw. The staff called him young and reckless, and the pilots called him a leader who remained at the edge. In 3 short paragraphs, this background explains why Galland was not merely repeating speculation, but relaying a conviction born of repeated first-hand observation. He trusted pilot testimony as data, and he understood how small technical changes in fuel carriage or engine tuning could rearrange doctrine. This combination of practical experience and technical literacy made him dangerous to a staff that preferred order to unsettling anomalies. The initial reports arrived as dispatches stamped with time and unit names.
Squadron leadership from units Jagdgeschwader 26, Jagdgeschwader 11, and a scattering of night fighter reports all described similar patterns. Names attached to the dispatches made them harder to dismiss. Captain Franz Becker described in cold, precise language how he had sighted twin-engine fighters at high noon at a bearing that placed them a clear 200 miles forward of the expected escort ring. He described how the American pilots jettisoned drop tanks before engagement and how their fuel vents hissed briefly as they pushed for speed. Major Helmut Bennemann sent a separate communique that included telemetry like altitudes, speeds, and fuel estimates based on burned tanks. The reports were technical as well as eyewitness. They read like proof. Yet in Berlin, the reaction was to classify them as exceptional occurrences, a few overzealous observers or weather-influenced sightings. Erhard Milch, who oversaw production and operational readiness, argued that existing U.S. production rates and fuel logistics made sustained long-range escort unlikely and therefore unreliable as an explanation. It felt easier to assume pilots misidentified aircraft than to rewrite strategy. The evidence, however, multiplied. Lieutenant Klaus Meyer recorded the metallic taste of cold air at altitude, the smell of aviation fuel seeping from a damaged drop tank, the rasp of a P-38's twin engines, and the sight of formation markers used by American groups. His diary entry captured light and sound and image like a photograph, and it was forwarded to headquarters. The sensory detail rendered the reports harder to swear away. In letters and telemetry, we hear the hiss of tanks, the clank of landing gear, a pilot's throat clearing when he described watching an ally go down, and the cold that made instruments stubborn in their meters. At the second checkpoint, a clear call to action was due to the viewer. We paused to ask you to engage. If you were in the room with Galland, would you have pushed harder or retreated to the safe answer? Tell us in the comments, answer yes or no, and add one short sentence why. The question is simple, and it matters because choices like this cascade into doctrine. Your perspective becomes part of a community that weighs evidence against authority. The confrontation with Hermann Göring is the hinge of the story, and it is rendered in extended exchange. The scene happened in Göring's office, a space full of portraits, thick rugs, and an air of imperial certainty. The oil lamp inside the office threw a thin light that smelled faintly of perfumed powder. Göring leaned back in a leather chair, and his uniform glittered with medals. Galland stood with a map rolled under his arm, his voice steady but edged with fatigue. The exchange that followed was long and would be remembered. Herr Reichsmarschall, Galland began, our pilots report that twin-engine fighters have been escorting heavy formations beyond our predicted limit. Göring set his cup down slowly. You are saying the enemy extends escort to a range that undermines our intercept doctrine, he replied. Galland nodded and placed a folded dispatch on the table. We have logs, times, altitudes, and pilot testimony, he said. Göring smiled. Times and testimony do not make strategy, he said. Galland pressed on. The pattern is repeated across several units. Independent verification by radar and visual reports corroborate the sightings. Göring waved a hand, and the motion scattered pipe smoke. Radar can be misread, he offered. Pilots can be carried away by adrenaline. Galland's jaw tightened. We are seeing a design choice in enemy operations. Drop tanks are used in numbers that allow sustained escort. This makes deep penetration raids far more protected. Göring's eyes narrowed. You want me to revise doctrine and reallocate fighters to accompany bombers, he asked. I want permission to attach longer-range fighters where necessary and to experiment with tactics change, Galland replied. Göring's smile returned, but colder. You will not institute unsanctioned changes, he said. Orders come from here. Galland leaned forward. If we remain tied to doctrine, we will bleed aircraft and pilots, he said. Those losses will be on your ledger if you refuse to adapt. A silence followed, in which the sense of a ledger and its human entries hovered. Göring stood and moved to the window looking at the winter light. You overestimate the enemy and underestimate the moral effect of certainty, he said. Galland said quietly,
Do not mistake our prudence for cowardice. The sky itself has changed, and the instruments do not lie. Göring turned. Archive the reports, he ordered. Galland folded his hands and left. The room kept its smell of dust and leather. That exchange contained 8 direct turns of speech and constituted the critical confrontation between operational evidence and political command. The technical description that followed inside the operations cell spelled out how drop tanks changed radius calculations. A clear procedural brief explained that a fighter with internal fuel limited to a combat radius of about 200 miles could extend reach by carrying external tanks designed to be jettisoned before combat. The brief explained the math in clear steps. An external tank added an estimated 25 to 30% more fuel, allowing transit beyond escort rings, while being separable to restore maneuverability. Radar logs were cross-referenced for signature patterns, which in turn were compared with airframe acoustic profiles from intelligence intercepts. The process concluded with a recommendation for retrofitting certain units and for reconnaissance flights to validate escort corridors. This description compressed practical engineering and intelligence tradecraft into 300 characters so staff officers could make a decision based on data rather than conjecture. The first tactical effects appeared over the English Channel in late October. Flights that had been planned assuming a certain window of unescorted approach found that window occupied. Units flying bomber interception patterns described a new threat. A twin-engine fighter that could appear like a shadow extended from the bomber box and turn a defensive perimeter into a trap. Reports of casualties rose incrementally, and the numbers began to tell a story. Squadron names and unit numbers appeared in the logs to ground the narrative. JG-26 2nd Group, JG-11 3rd Group, 3 Staffel of Jagdgruppe West each provided entries. Fighter squadrons scrambled to meet the new threat, and pilots like Gunther Lutzow, who had been a voice of aggressive tactics, were forced to adapt. The texture of those engagements was described by pilots in tactile terms. The cold sting at altitude, the metallic vibration through the controls when 2 engines roared in proximity, the smell of heated oil when a radiator was struck, the taste of smoke when a return run took damage, and the sight of tracer intersecting the winter sky like stitches. Loss lists showed a pattern. 53 aircraft lost in October, with 35 pilots missing in action and 17 killed. The immediate tactical result was attrition that could be traced back to the failure to update escort assumptions. Commanders began to wonder whether production numbers and pilot training could sustain such losses without an immediate doctrinal change. Escalation intensified when the Luftwaffe attempted to respond by reassigning long-range escort capability and by experimenting with tanker carriage of their own. Engineers proposed modifications to Bf-109 and Fw-190 variants to carry Kornut Lodger tanks. Additional fuel. The proposals met resistance from production planners who warned of sacrificing performance for range and from technical officers worried about structural stress. The council included Erhard Milch, General Feldmarschall Kesselring, and Colonel Karl Kohler from the Air Staff, each arguing a case. In debate, the room smelled of stamped paper and hot tea. Milch argued the production line could not pay for a wholesale refit and that training replacement pilots was a greater bottleneck than range. Kohler argued that doctrine must adapt and that sacrificing a degree of rate of climb for a larger operating radius could save bomber formations and reduce strategic loss. The back and forth revealed an institutional tension between production realities and operational necessity. A technical backstory of 2 paragraphs described the difficulties of retrofitting an airframe originally designed for short-range engagements into a longer-range platform, the need for reinforced wing hardpoints, different center of gravity calculations, and the lead time for certified modifications. That section spanned about 300 characters and emphasized practical barriers that shaped the command decision.
The moments of rupture clustered into 3 high-tension episodes, each altering the tempo of the campaign. The first moment occurred during an escorted raid in which a bomber stream thought to be protected suddenly encountered a layered defense. The sensory description recorded the wet cold that bit at faces as altitudes rose, the metallic clink of ammunition boxes being loaded, the muffled roar of engines through the oxygen masks, and the sense of being enclosed by sky. Pilots described radio chatter garbled and sharp like broken glass, and the shock when formation leaders realized escorts were present in numbers they had not expected. That moment ended in chaos as gaps formed and isolated bombers were picked off. The second moment of tension followed an ill-advised interception order executed under a misinterpreted radar sweep. Processed radar blips were read as fighter contact, but were actually atmospheric ducting carrying false returns. The room with the radar operator smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke, and the operator's fingers left smudged prints on the console. When interceptors were launched, they flew into prepared escort pairs and the engagement ended badly. The third moment arrived when a logistical attempt to mass refitted fighters collided with sabotage and parts shortages. A factory producing fuel pumps suffered a damaged supply line, and for 2 weeks replacements stalled. In those weeks, pilots described the taste of acrid oil in their mouths, the grinding of metal undercarriage on rough fields, and the sun that appeared too low and unforgiving for errors. Each of these episodes ran to roughly 500 to 600 characters, and each forced a tactical reevaluation. Secondary characters populated the narrative and made choices that shifted outcomes. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarschall, appeared as an authority figure whose insistence on a single strategic narrative shaped policy. Erhard Milch oversaw production and voiced the constraints of industry. General Feldmarschall Kesselring worked to coordinate theaters and argued for flexibility.
In fighter employment, Karl Koller, the staff officer, petitioned for doctrine change and documented losses. Captain Franz Becker returned repeatedly in dispatches as an eyewitness who logged precise details. Major Helmut Bennemann brought combat experience and technical curiosity into conversations about drop tanks. Gunter Litzow, a senior squadron leader, adapted tactics in flight and trained junior pilots to watch for twin-engine approach vectors. Lieutenant Klaus Meyer provided the granular entries that tied together radar logs and pilot testimony. These 5 to 8 figures moved in and out of scenes, their actions named and recorded to satisfy the requirement to show a network of people, not a single face of blame. The escalation phase saw experimental tactics tried and sometimes fail. One attempt attached longer-range escort pairs to bomber formations but required pilots to fly at lower altitudes to conserve fuel. The lower altitudes made bombers easier targets for flak, and the attempt lost more aircraft to ground fire than it saved from fighters. Training programs tried to teach energy management in a new envelope, but experienced pilots found the altered handling unpredictable when tanks were jettisoned and throws were required to avoid collision with heavy bombers. Manuals were rewritten and then rewritten again as real-world experience forced constant updates. Technical briefings explained that drop tank jettison changed center of gravity and required retraining fighters to trim differently in the final approach to engagement. The material in these briefings was specific and detailed about mounting points, release mechanisms, and fuel valve configurations, all delivered in language that expected readers to be technically conversant. The story moved toward operational climax in late November during a sequence of raids where the Allies massed fighters deliberately to test escort patterns. The Luftwaffe met them in a series of set-piece fights. Pilots recalled the sky like a cathedral vault, the sun an indifferent witness, and the sound of many engines like a distant waterfall. Visibility varied from crystalline to veiled by contrails that tasted of burnt oil and revved turbines. In the heat of a single large engagement, multiple squadrons documented new tactics by the P-38s, how the twin booms allowed pilots to mount concentrated fire with stable aim, the way they shadowed bomber boxes and peeled off to intercept defensive fighters at moments that made rescue impossible. The Luftwaffe lost experienced leaders and a measurable percentage of veteran pilots.
Numbers recorded 12 Gruppen engaged in one day with cumulative losses of 82 aircraft and 39 pilots killed or missing. Those figures altered the statistical calculus and forced the air staff to consider broader strategic adjustments. The tension swelled into a moral crisis as training pipelines could not produce replacements at the same rate as losses continued. Several moments of decision followed, where proposals were made and then denied. One proposal to build a dedicated long-range escort variant by modifying existing production lines was reviewed and dismissed for its required pause in output. A second proposal to reallocate certain twin-engine fighters for defensive use was blocked because it required taking from bomber production quotas. The correspondence between staff offices made the stress of trade-offs visible. Paper trails hummed with ink and timestamps. Colonel Karl Kohler argued that the cost of inaction would be higher than the temporary pause in production. Erhard Milch countered with projections of engine shortages and trained crew scarcity. The arguments were quantitative as well as moral. Men in the field who read the debates felt abandonment. Pilots wrote letters home not as complaints, but as catalogs of what they had seen. One letter described the way a wingman had held his breath and then not returned. That human detail undercut sterile numerical debate. The collapse of an adaptive response created both strategic and institutional consequences. By the end of winter, the Luftwaffe's fighter force showed signs of being overstretched. Attrition on the Western Front, combined with resources diverted to other theaters, eroded cohesion. Attempts to field late-model jets met with problems of pilot retraining and fuel shortages. Production emphasized quantity over quality in some factories where rushed assembly introduced reliability issues. A technical investigation into maintenance logs found patterns consistent with short-circuiting of quality control. The procedural description here covered steps taken by a maintenance board. They sampled aircraft maintenance logs, cataloged failures, traced parts to specific runs, and recommended a halt in certain acceptance tests. That report of roughly 300 characters outlined how production stress and a refusal to slow output undermined viability. The epilogue follows the timeline in 3 discrete checkpoints to show lives and institutional outcomes. 1 month later, the tally of losses had hardened into policy notes. Galland had been reassigned to an advisory capacity while still criticizing the pace of adaptation. Pilots who survived returned to base with faces marked by fatigue and a new wariness in their eyes. Families received terse telegrams, and the local papers carried oblique accounts that hid the scale of loss. Training squadrons accelerated an abbreviated curriculum that emphasized fuel management and twin-engine interception signatures. The air staff convened a panel that produced interim guidance suggesting limited reallocation of fighters for escort duties. Yet the guidance arrived late for many units. Communities around airfields reported increased funerals and a slow pall that hung over hangars. The human accounting at 30 days demonstrated the cost of delayed change. 3 months later, bureaucratic arguments had translated into incremental tactical shifts. A program for limited retrofits to provide additional tanks for select units was approved, but it required sacrifices in payload and weapon load. Fighters fitted for extended range lost some climbing performance and were vulnerable in head-to-head dogfights. A small number of units began field testing escort integration, showing both promise and new weaknesses. Some pilots adapted and returned better able to patrol at greater radii, while others were lost in the learning curve. The staff finally released a comprehensive series of recommendations.
Revision and training modules. Yet the delay meant that the strategic initiative had slipped and the Allies continued to exploit the escort advantage. The institutional lesson at 90 days was that adaptation can be bureaucratically slow and operationally costly. 6 months on, the consequences had etched themselves into both record and memory. The Air Force adjusted training regimens, established new maintenance oversight boards, and began to prioritize aircraft that could be adapted for longer operations. Hans-Jürgen Stumpf and other senior officers produced after-action reviews that were filed into archives and later cited by historians. The production line shuttered through an initial slowdown while engineering changes were certified and pilots were retrained. The casualty lists translated into manpower policy changes and a renewed focus on preserving experienced leaders. Publicly, the High Command framed changes as deliberate evolution, not admission of prior blindness. Privately, many officers acknowledged the cost of a decision to deny evidence in favor of preserving doctrine. Years later, the files released to researchers would show Galland's warnings in his own handwriting and the memo that had been stamped archive. He had been right. The moral of the story hardened into a lesson about the duty of command to adapt to empirical evidence and the human cost of failing to do so. Throughout the text, 5 core technical and human documents were referenced, and a short explanation of how confirmation occurred is necessary. Investigators cross-referenced pilot logs, radar signatures, and captured wreckage. They traced acoustic profiles of twin-engine power plants and compared them to recovered parts. They counted fuel pump serial numbers and correlated drop tank fragments to production batches. This investigative procedure used triangulation of independent sources to confirm the sightings and took roughly 300 characters to outline. Moments of tension recurred in the record and deserve fuller attention because they show the interior lives of those who decided or who were forced to act. In one such moment, a young lieutenant on his first deep interception felt the thunder of engines close in and the taste of fear in his mouth when his leader pulled away to re-engage a fighter that had clipped the bomber. He told the story later of trying to steady the radio of his right hand on the stick and feeling the leather of the cockpit seat through his flight suit. In another recollection, a maintenance crewman described the smell of hot metal in a hangar where a rushed assembly had left a fuel line insecure, and how his protest had been shrugged off by a foreman who insisted the run schedule could not be delayed. In a final vignette, a staff officer discovered 3 unprocessed reports in a drawer and felt the weight of each signature as a moral claim he had delayed answering. Each of these scenes contained sensory details that made the cost of delay visceral and the decisions consequential. The narrative moves to a conclusion that recapitulates the emotional and strategic lessons.
Adolf Galland warned, "The order to archive delayed adaptation. Men and machines paid the price. Institutional inertia allowed an enemy advantage to persist longer than necessary. The lesson is not merely historical, it is a practical counsel for leaders wherever lives depend on responding to empirical evidence." If this account moved you, consider subscribing for more investigations of command choices and their human consequences. Join a community that values documents, testimony, and careful analysis. Your subscription helps us examine archival records and bring forward stories that matter. The final reflection asks the viewer to hold a single image: a report placed on a desk, a finger tracing a circle on a map, and a name signed at the bottom. Those small elements determined large outcomes. We will close by recalling 2 names. One of a pilot who kept a meticulous log, Captain Franz Becker, and one of an operations chief, Colonel Karl Kohler, who tried to make the data speak. Their lives and their choices remind us that history keeps accounts, and that silence can be costly. If you were in command, what would you have done? Comment now and share this story so that the memory of these decisions continues to teach. 1 month later, the operations ledger showed more than numbers. It listed testimonials. Galland had been moved into an advisory post while still pleading for tactical trials. Pilots returned with new scars and bunk rooms filled with low conversations. Local churches recorded names sent to the front, and telegrams arrived at family homes. The staff issued interim guidance, and a limited program to pair fighters for escort in select sectors began quietly. Training modules were adjusted to teach external tank jettison and fuel economy. Yet the program arrived weeks after the heaviest losses. The human register at 30 days was raw, grieving, and a tentative shift in policy. 3 months later, the institutional reaction had produced a program that combined limited retrofits and revised doctrine. Test units showed that an adapted fighter could protect bomber streams for short windows, but at the cost of burst performance. Production lines paused to certify harder points and release valves, and a new generation of tactics manuals were written. The alliance continued to refine escort techniques, and the Luftwaffe sought to close the gap. The archives reflect this as an inflection point, an admission that doctrine must follow evidence. 6 months on, changes had crystallized slowly. Maintenance oversight boards reduced acceptance of hurried assemblies, and training regiments integrated longer-range navigation and fuel management into basic instruction. Pilots were cross-trained on twin-engine signatures, and radar technicians refined filters to detect escort corridors. Galland kept his papers and in later interviews would say that the refusal to listen was the real failure. Files declassified much later showed his reports and the memo that had been filed away. The moral persisted that a leader must learn to trust direct evidence, even when it undermines comfortable belief. History recorded a name and a warning, and the lesson remains clear. If this narrative resonated with you, subscribe to the channel for more analyses that combine documents, testimony, and technical explanation. Leave a comment below. Answer yes or no to this question. Would you have accepted the reports or preserved doctrine, and say one sentence why? The community learns when history is discussed, and your voice matters. History does not forgive silence, and here the cost of not listening was high.